Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Embodied Dialogue podcast. My name is Seth Dellinger, and I have with me today Susan Campbell. She is the author of this book, Getting Real. And this was part of my training, Susan, when I was at the Circling Institute a few years back. So the subtitle of the book is 10 Truth Skills You Need to Live an Authentic Life. And Susan has many other books. She is a clinical psychologist, an organizational development consultant, has been teaching on the graduate faculty at UMass. But with all the things you've done, perhaps it's safe to say that Getting Real is at the heart of it, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so we want to talk about Getting Real, which has to do with how we communicate. And eventually what we wanted to get to was this situation after the elections in the US, but we're not going to start there. Let's just start with, what does it mean to get real?
All right. Well, I started out teaching this practice of getting real with the idea that we all value honest communication, but how many of us really have the requisite honesty skills? So much of the time when we think we're being honest, we're throwing out a judgment or something that we've been harboring that we just need to get off our chest, but we haven't really looked at what feelings, what things inside of ourselves, where that comes from. So we're often not very self-aware. We might think we're trying to be understood, but really we're just throwing out an attack. Those are kind of honesty mistakes, and those are honest human mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
So the first idea is how to be more skillfully honest. And then the idea that you aren't always that self-aware when you think you're being honest. So this is really a whole bunch of awareness practices, Seth, things that help people get more in touch with their actual present felt experience before just going, bleh.
Right. But it sounds like sometimes we do just do that. And so what I heard you say was also like awareness of the fact that sometimes our awareness is lacking.
Yeah.
And in your book, one of the things that you highlight a lot is also just the compassion that we have to have with the fact that this is not easy.
Well, yeah. And some of these truth skills, one of them that comes to mind right now is going out and coming in again. I just went, bleh, I just dumped, a whole bunch of extra feelings on you that were really meant for my kid that I had some trouble with earlier today, but I didn't feel heard over there. So now I'm determined to be heard by you. And I revised later on. I realized, oh, geez, what I wished I'd said was. So some of the truth skills take account of the fact that our first try at honesty isn't always our final answer. And it gives, yes, compassion for yourself that happens, and giving ourselves permission to just go out and come in again. Remember that phrase? I mean, this isn't new to me. If I had it to do over, here's what I wish I would have done or said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's we call those truth skills.
Right, right. And that feels really valuable just because what you said about, these feelings, they just come up very quickly. We're sitting here talking, and then you say some particular word. It might just be in passing as far as what you're talking about. And suddenly my body shifts and so to be able to slow things down, in conversation, because of course, we know that okay, if I have an hour to meditate, great. But how do we do that in the midst of free-flowing conversation?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple that I talk about in the book Getting Real, where they're having their 30th wedding anniversary, and the husband makes a toast to the wife, and he starts his toast with, well, I looked up on Wikipedia all the things that had to do with 30 years, and all I could see in there was reference to the 30 Years' War. And then before he even gets any further, he was going to say, in spite of our conflicts, we've been so close, and all these years and we always forgive and so forth. But he didn't get to his whole speech because she hears 30 years war. Our marriage is like a war. And so they're at this little small dinner party with their friends, and she takes off with a kind of quick, not very spacious interpretation. And that's called getting triggered. And so I bring in this whole notion of, in order to slow things down, because they often do, forgivably just go off the rails, you go into fight, flight, and so forth. We need to first be aware that triggering happens and learn what the early warning signs of your own trigger reactions are. So that's a big part of getting real, because one of the true skills is owning when you're projecting something onto another person. And in this case, she was just projecting her fear that she wasn't like lovable, or that she wasn't being loved. He was talking about all the bad times. That was her reactive story, is what we call it. And then if she would have been aware of her reactive body sensations, she would have felt like heat in her face and, maybe making some fists or tight arms and so forth. So in this getting real work, we learn about projections, and we learn that we often project our fears onto lots of different situations very quickly. And that is called getting triggered. And this is a normal brain reaction, getting triggered. It just, brain scientists tell us there's this survival alarm system in our brain that's always scanning for, am I safe, or is there danger here? So she hears her husband say that, and all of a sudden, danger, danger, in her amygdala area of the brain. That's called the survival alarm system by brain scientists. So we, after going through 10, 20, 30, 100 of those as a married couple or a human being in life, you begin to hopefully get curious, like, how can I tell when I'm triggered? And how can I tell when other people are triggered? Okay, myself, I feel this like spacing out. Like some people feel like deer in the headlights. Other people feel like running out of the room. Other people feel more like punching something. What about you, Seth? Do you ever get triggered?
I think one of the things that happens for me is my throat, I think, kind of gets tight. And then there's a way that speaking actually feels like just the act of speaking can be tense,
Yeah.
And then just a sense of speeding up, right? So if I notice the words are coming out really quickly, then can I breathe, Um, I'm curious also, you said it could be me. It could be the other person. So what if you're feeling pretty calm, cool, and collected, but what you're saying is not landing the way you're intending it? The other person seems to be triggered. What are some of the things that you might suggest there?
Good. I want to actually pick up on one of the things you said, was just like speeding up. I've had situations, it was actually in an old job where my boss asked me to proofread something and give him suggestions. And so I started out giving him some suggestions. And then, and he's commenting, fairly receptive, because I hadn't gotten to anything triggering for him yet. But when I really start to get into specific things I would do differently, all of a sudden his comments got longer and more, almost like higher tone of voice, sped up, that kind of thing. So be mindful, folks, when you think you're in a normal conversation, but the other person starts like repeating themselves, or their voice goes up, or also maybe you could notice that their throat starts to sound like constricted. Could be, so it doesn't always have to be more aggressive when the other person's triggered. Sometimes they start to like shut down or look at the floor or something like that. So just being mindful at all times that just the slightest thing can throw me into feeling calm and safe, from feeling calm and safe into feeling unsafe. And that's called getting triggered. And it happens to almost everybody. It's forgivable. But if we stay talking, while I'm still trying to be heard and he's got kind of going off automatically, we just get farther and farther apart.
Hmm.
So one of the skills is, hey, can we just pause and feel what we're feeling now and maybe check in? So that would be one of the skills that I advise if you find yourself in that kind of situation, or if you yourself find yourself like over explaining or debating when it was supposed to be like a collaboration.
Right.
Ask
Right.
for a pause, or if it's not safe to ask for a pause, take a bathroom break.
Mhm.
Just anything. But in order to do any of those things, you have to have kind of a noticer online. You have to have the kind of mind, first of all, that accepts that things aren't always like comfortable and you're not always in control. So we have to kind of get used to what I call relating to an ever-changing reality instead of controlling, which is, ooh, you asked me a question that I felt unprepared to answer. So then I start criticizing you, why are you prodding me and pursuing me all the time? Simple conversations become almost like life-threatening for a
Mhm.
moment.
Mhm.
Just like knowing that and accepting that and being able to like observe for how safe do I feel, like noticing my body sensations, my breath. And does this other person start to show signs of lack of safety? There's nothing scary about me, but something just happened inside them.
Mhm.
So these are self-awareness practices, but they start with everything isn't always under your control or just the way you wish it would be, accepting that.
And it sounds like these are things that, to some degree, we want to work on over time. And there's maybe certain conversations that are just going to turn out the way they're turning out. And then we're going to come back to the next one, maybe in a new place. But you talked about control. And I think maybe it's in Getting Real or somewhere. I've seen you say in the Western civilization, we're addicted to control.
Right.
So this is a strong habit. Um, what would be a different intention that we could cultivate and distinguish, and how might we do that?
Yeah. So first, let me define what I mean when I say, the American culture is addicted to control. I've actually done some informal research that looks to me like about 80%, 80 to 90% of normal conversations that we have with other people, we have some kind of an agenda. So this is, to control the outcome in something as simple as I want this person to think well of me.
Mhm.
And I want to hide something that has them maybe not feeling uh, that positive toward me. So controlling communication. So I'm talking about controlling communication. Although sometimes you need to control, like you need to control your child from running into the middle of the street, and there are other times where control is totally appropriate if you're a parent or you're a boss or something. But you do it intentionally. But what I'm talking about is this unconscious agenda to have things turn out comfortably for yourself, predictably, not too unpleasant or not too complex for most of us. So I want whatever happens after I like risk giving my boss feedback or risk speaking my mind in a group of friends even. The control mindset is I want whatever happens after I take that risk to be comfortable and not have any unexpected things happen that I might have to deal with.
Mhm.
Um, so I think we could all relate to, we'd rather have our environment predictable and friendly and safe and all that. But that doesn't always happen. And the idea of gearing all your communication so that it only comes out nice is going to weaken you because you're actually affirming, by that behavior, you're actually affirming that I can't handle all these unexpected things that actually happen a lot in life, like somebody misunderstanding us. if somebody misunderstands you, that's not a life or death situation, but sometimes it feels that way because our nervous system, perhaps, especially if we have, childhood uh, experiences of not being listened to, not being heard. So the feeling of being misunderstood can be very, very sensitive to the child part of us. I call it the tender part
Right.
of the being. And so the tender part will sometimes get triggered. But this whole control thing is what we're talking about. So the idea that's the alternative to approaching a conversation strategically so that I only give this much information and so forth. The alternative is what I call relating. And so one of the big deals in the Getting Real 10 Truth Skills is, do you know the intent of your communication in any given moment? Is it to relate? And I'll tell you what relating means now, but is it to relate or to control? Relating has you being aware of your present felt experience, like what's going on in your body, what do you actually see? Because this is the whole purpose of Getting Real is, what do I see? What do I hear out there? What happens then inside my body and my mind? Do I make up a story that this person is not understanding me? And maybe they're not, but that's your kind of instinctive characteristic story, which paralyzes you because that's your trigger. It puts you into the fight, flight, freeze zone rather than, gee, would you tell me what you understood just so I can feel more heard? Something just natural. If you're not triggered, you'll just admit that I felt a little squeamish about how you responded to me. I want to hear what you're responding to. So that's sort of like normal talk. When you're not triggered, you're going to be pretty much real to the extent that you've learned these skills. So relating actually means two-way communication, sharing what I feel, what I want, being curious about your reaction when I speak. So it doesn't have a thing to do with controlling the outcome. It's, curious about the outcome. Like, I'd love to hear how that landed for you when I said I didn't want to do that, let's say. Again, all normal conversations, little differences here and there. So relating is cultivating. We really need to cultivate the ability to stay in our present felt experience, notice when we're getting into, oh, that person's not responding the way I thought they should, or the way I expected or wanted. That happens so often. And just being aware then of, oh, what that did inside of me. And relating can still be, I was hoping for a different answer there, that type of thing. I often say that to my partner, it wasn't quite the answer I was hoping for. You're not triggered, but you're having a difference.
But I can easily imagine someone not getting the answer they wanted and not saying anything.
Absolutely.
Going to
Absolutely.
swallow this, but then there's some kind of pressure that's building up
Mhm.
through the feeling of I didn't like that, but the fear of saying I didn't like that. So that might be another angle on what you're talking about, is that it's just really the truth is very inconvenient often.
It is.
Or another thing that came to mind, you mentioned, so let's say I'm at work and there's some meeting, and
Mhm.
9 out of 10 people agree that we should do X, but I'm the 10th person who thinks we should do Y. But that's really what I think. Um, it's definitely uncomfortable, but there might be some reason. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm have some
Mhm.
information that no one else has, or I just have a perspective that no one else has. Uh, and it sounds like if I'm going to be able to speak, I just have to be prepared for the unknown consequences. Like, I have to be willing to come what may. Um, and I wonder, I don't know what you would say about cultivating that, or even in the moment where I'm about to say this thing and I don't know how it's going to go. What are some things you would say about that?
Okay, good. Well, speaking a minority opinion in a group of your peers or a group of people who are important to you, you're probably going to be aware that it's somewhat of a risk. And let's say you're in this meeting, so you're sitting there debating, should I say it or not? I think that's what most of us might do. Uh, Although there's this thing called control patterns, which I'll get to in a minute, but some people, they don't, maybe my MO, my general communication style is to sit with something a little too long. And then I've missed the moment. How many people have been in meetings where, why didn't I just say that? But you've missed the moment because that's one of your control patterns that has you overthink things. In order to control patterns are automatic personality habits, and we all have a variety of these, but one is waiting, hanging back. It's designed to manage whether I'm safe or I'm going to be criticized, that sort of thing. In that case, I'm not going to, I can't say it. Or there's other people whose control pattern is just blurted out without realizing that, I've already had a really stressful day. And if I get too much criticism from my peers, it's just going to put me over the edge for all the rest of the things I have to do today.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how many people can reflect on themselves that way yet? But the stuff that I teach, and if you consciously practice it and say, okay, I'm going to, even if I didn't practice it when I was in the meeting, I blurted it out. I'm going to go home tonight and I'm going to go, man, I wish I would have just breathed, gotten a little more centered, and then said it. And this is one of those truth skills where I advise you to, at the end of the day, look back and go, when did I not show up the way I wished I would, not show up real or present? And go back over that in your own mind and actually go, oh, it's the if I had it to do over, but you just do it in front of your own mirror in your own bathroom and just say, yes, here's what I would have done. And actually, I'm going to do it right now and just kind of correct that overreactive neural network. Because each time you go through this and you do something in a slower, more aware way, you are actually building new brain capacity. So that's one part of an answer to if you're there. So I don't necessarily recommend, oh, I'm just going to take a risk because I'm feeling pretty cocky today. If you are feeling pretty strong inwardly, or you can handle a certain amount of discomfort, good. Or if you just want to stretch your comfort zone consciously, and this is what I think we should all be doing a lot more often, consciously stretching our, saying, I don't know how this is going to turn out, but in fact, I might even preface with, I feel a little vulnerable before saying this because you all seem to have an agreement about this, and I kind of don't. Can I tell you how I see this whole thing? So naming your state or naming that there's a difference, get ready, folks, because I have a different, you're creating a little more safety for yourself. So once again, that's one of the skills that's in that book.
Yeah. So eventually I'm going to want to ask you about, the situation really not just in the US, it's around the world today. There's all this polarization and difference. But what we've been talking about so far, there's a couple things here. One is just like, how do I not jump to conclusions too quickly, which I might do with a person who sees things differently than I do. But also, how can I not shy away from the fact that my truth is that I see things differently than you do, perhaps. And you've been teaching this work for decades, and you have some real experience with people at very different starting places actually finding more of a sense of connection. So before we get to kind of the here and now, I would love to hear a little bit about, for example, I know in the 60s you had what was called the Hawks and the Doves, which were groups for and against the war in Vietnam, basically. And you found yourself facilitating some of those groups And there's some other places we could go, but that's the first one that comes to mind. And particularly, I mean, anything you want to share, but I'm interested. What is the process where some of those apparently really difficult to overcome disagreements actually can be transcended, at least to some degree, and more of a connection and a seeing eye to eye can happen?
Okay, well, in my very first Substack post, it had to do with cooperating with people or learning to communicate with people that we view as other. And I gave this example of a group of managers that I led actually numerous times. There were these small groups where companies sent their managers. These were pretty much all men in those days in the 60s and early 70s. And you'd sit in a room with these same 12 men for all day, and then we'd have an evening session too, and just share feelings. Okay, this and learn how your behavior impacts others. It used to be called sensitivity training back in those days, and later it was called T groups. So I was a facilitator of many of these, and I'll just give one example, but the same type of thing happened a lot because it was during the Vietnam War era. And this was kind of in the background for a lot of people. They didn't come in talking about it. Uh, but over time, after a while, you just sit and talk to the same people, and more stuff just bubbles up that, well, what do we do now? Or what's coming into my awareness now? And it just comes out. So somebody one man expressed that he was so sad that his son just got drafted into the Vietnam War. And then somebody else pipes up, well, what do you mean sad? Isn't he a good patriotic American? And so we're starting to begin to see some polarization. That's maybe after 2 or 3 days that this group's been meeting together. Because usually in the beginning, people are just feeling out in any group, they're kind of
Not the
feeling out
first topic
how,
they want to bring up.
what, what'd you say?
I said it's not the first topic they want to bring up when you.
That's true. It's not. No, they're just feeling out how involved do I even want to be in this group.
Mhm.
So those of you who are facilitators of any kind of group, like a new team, you're assigned to this new team or whatever, there's this first like jockeying for position. Who do I like and not? And do I feel out of it or safe or so forth? But then people get relatively comfortable with each other, and then this pops up. It's the same way with couples. You're in your romance stage for a while, but then all of a sudden this surprising conflict stuff comes up. And so now we're talking about pro and con people valuing going to Vietnam, intervening in that part of the world. And those were called the hawks, who were like pro-war, and people who were against the war were called the doves. Okay, some of you might read about this in history books, but I was there. And so that polarization was very painful in our culture in those days. And people often tend to avoid it, but there'd be all these rallies and protests and things like that that made a lot of men coming back from the war feel devalued because so many people, were against the war. And it was, a lot of pain in our world at that time. Then people start piling on. Well, I would go, I would volunteer. Well, I sure would. This is a ridiculous war. We should be over there. And so there's opinions now. When people start getting into opinions rather than their feelings, that's also something where the facilitator might need to say, okay, and as I didn't write this in the article, but in retrospect, I would often say, as you say those words, what do you notice in your body? Or as you say that, what do you feel? Because facilitator's role is to help people get more present and real. Okay, so I do some of that, and people got a little more connected to their bodies and their feelings. But there was still polarization. And then one of the guys said, I used to never believe in war, but I have 5 kids to support and a wife. And yeah, I work for Lockheed, and we make munitions for the war effort. And I'm not going to quit my job. And, it just brought a little softness to the room. And then, a few more people chimed in. And then so we weren't completely at odds when I made the sort of magical intervention, which was, let's just step back and look at how it's been going the last day or two here with us. And so that's the idea of kind of getting above the level of the problem so we can learn a little bit more and so we can feel united. Because
Mhm.
from a big picture angle, the world today, if we could all get looking at, well, what are we really upset about? A lot of what we're really upset about is the polarization that we seem to be all caught in,
Mhm.
or other things which we can imagine, like consumerism, or too much electronics in our world, and we're controlled by that. But in this case, back in the War of Vietnam era, it was like, yeah, we don't like the fact that we're split in two like this. Oh, we've learned to care about each other. We're just humans, and look at all the things we've discovered we have in common. So it was like once you get above the fight, people began to realize that, what's making me feel safe in this group, when he first talked about his kid having to go to war. Oh, that somehow, he's like, I realize he's a human being and
Right.
not
Right.
not just other. So that whole story, which I told in my first Substack, kind of helped see a general principle for all of us for today's argument too, about who's
Right.
blue and red, or pro um, America first versus more internationalism. There's a lot of polarities within the blue-red.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you mentioned that you're writing on Substack. I meant to say that in the beginning. I read that article, and since the election, you have an article on how people, including one of your clients, was triggered by the election results. That was the title. And then post-election reflection, how I've learned to love my fears. Um, that feels like a little bit of a side note to where we're at right now, but I did want to mention it. But there's another facilitation from that first article that you mentioned, which was groups of whites and African Americans together.
Yeah.
And the reason I thought to bring that up before we get to today is I can imagine people being in the room around the Vietnam War, and you look around the room and maybe there's something about how people dress, but you can't necessarily tell. But then
Mhm.
in the second situation, the difference, there may well be differences of opinion, but there's big differences of experience. What's it like to grow up as a white person or as a black person in America?
Yes.
So it's a different kind of thing. And when we do get to today, I would say, I mean, if we looked at the blue red
Mhm.
thing, there is
Mhm.
a difference of opinion clearly, but there tends to be a very different experience of, because it tended to be urban and rural in a lot of cases.
Yeah,
I'm
and
also curious,
education level and all that stuff. Yeah.
right. So, but I wonder if you would maybe want to say something about that other experience, that other historical experience before we get
Mhm.
to today.
Yeah. Well, one of the other polarization challenges in that same era, this was the early 70s, were blacks and whites. These are educated blacks and whites now, so they're more similar than rich and poor
Mhm.
in any time in history. So they're college educated, and a lot of them were like professors and so forth. Blacks and whites. This was in the culture a huge, let's say, a huge dilemma for our culture to kind of, I'm going to say, get over, because there's like a big north-south divide. That's always been here around segregation versus school integration. Again, I lived through that, and I believe that whole polarization hasn't been healed yet. But that was very up for educated blacks and whites in the 70s. And in this particular case, the people volunteered to come to a Black-white encounter group. And I led several of these. But this was a much different attitude because they're going in with the intent to learn, also the intent to hear something uncomfortable, but to just see what the experience of the other is like. So the whole design was to promote civil discourse. And the big question, I mean, the design was really the whites are in the outer circle and the blacks are in the inner circle first, let's say, talking about what it was like to grow up as a minority in a majority white culture. And then the whites would get in the center and would talk about, first of all, their response to what they heard the blacks saying. So this was actually a designed situation to promote understanding. So there wasn't polarization, but there was, if I said something about what one of the blacks comments about, like, always having to watch over your shoulder if there's a police car in the vicinity. Now we weren't very aware of that back in the 70s. Most whites and blacks would not even be shocked by the fact that a black person in a white neighborhood wearing a hoodie might have reason to feel paranoid. But in those days, that was like, so that was shocking to some of us. Oh no, my son's a cop, and he doesn't tell me any of that, so forth. So if you tended to disagree, there would be pretty raucous anger for a while. So, but what we were learning, and our goal in learning, was just how to handle big feelings without kind of going away, how to respect the pain of the other. Whether it was fully successful or not, I think overall it led to more mutual understanding for sure. But back in those days, there was a tendency for whites to be almost like overly solicitous to Black people, in educated circles. So I think that was pointed out to us by the Black people, but never fully got healed. And I think over time, the whites have gotten it a little bit more, don't act out your white guilt on us type of comments, right, sort of thing. Right. So it was a designed learning environment, and there was really no natural polarization. Polarization was just acknowledged right from the beginning. Right. And we were there to, right. You have to ground rules, so then the transfer to today is, if you're going to try to have a conversation with somebody who is of a different political stripe than you, first of all, I would ask you why. What's your motive? Is it to relate or to control? Would be one of the first things, because I had an impulse to talk to one of my relatives who I knew had always voted Republican and voted for Trump, and said things like climate change is a hoax, and segregation never, integration, racial integration never should have happened, and so forth. So, my motive was to see if I could just get to know her better. She's a relative, but I had to, I have to really sit with myself, is my motive to change her mind at all? Because that would be a controlling thing. To educate her, or even is my motive to be heard by her? If I'm attached at all to an outcome like that, well, just be aware of that and decide whether to keep going or not. But maybe my motive, and in this case, it really was just to really be curious and understand what in her world had her feel the way she does. And she actually told me some interesting stories about, because she was a school teacher back when forced busing was happening in the schools where blacks were being bused quite a ways from their neighborhoods to go to white schools. And so then she's a teacher in one of these schools, and she said, the blacks always hang out with the blacks and the whites always hang out with the whites. What's the difference? And it's so much harder to teach people who are of different levels for the teacher. And so I really understood a lot just by being curious. That was my only motive, along with I did have a little bit of attachment to an outcome. I didn't want her to hate me. So I was extremely respectful and I stayed curious. And so is this true? Feeding back. So if you're sincere and you want to understand something, here's what I heard you say. Is that right? Now, aside, so that all went very well. And I really left with a lot of tenderness for her passion to be a good teacher and to have the students, because I didn't say all that, but she really showed her caring for the students, and the best student experience possible would be not having half of her students uncomfortable with the other half in her classroom. You know what I mean? That's hard for teachers. But who thinks of that? I didn't.
Right. Well, and her experience feels really real and relatable on a human level, and yet
Yeah.
because of the overall context,
Hmm.
see how her capacity to share that experience might feel compromised because the way that everything was moving in the country at this point was not it was that she was going to have to deal with this, and her difficulty in doing so was
Hmm.
not the main headline in the newspaper. It was,
Yeah.
so um, it just sounds like you still disagreed, and yet when you left that interaction, she had more dimensions for you. She was,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I do want to say one more insight that I got from that conversation. The person that you're talking with, so she didn't have a lot of insight about some of the deeper sources of her pain, which had to do with what I'm going to say is the divide that the Civil War created between North and the South have not gotten healed. This is my assessment. And I never even thought of that until, I picked up little things like, we're not so stupid, we're okay. She's identifying as a Southerner against Northerners to
Mm,
this day.
mm, mhm.
Things like that, well, look at all the nice things about the South, because I go between the North and the South a lot because my mother was born in Tennessee. So I have a whole family down there. And I never realized that. And see, so here's the thing. You talk to somebody who, if you're sincere and you listen to them with depth, it doesn't still translate necessarily to you trusting that their self-awareness is 100%. She said what she needed to say, but I picked up what I thought was another level. Now that's a story I'm telling myself, and
Mhm.
I don't think I have any axe to grind with that story. When you make up a story, that the person didn't actually say,
Right.
you want to really look at why would I even think that? But my point is, even if they're not very forthcoming about some of their real motives, she was somewhat forthcoming. But even if they're not, you pick up useful information about this other person and you feel something. And with that piece of it, I felt deep sadness to hear her defend being a Southerner, but we didn't go there.
Mm,
Be the next time I talk to her, we could seriously go there.
right. Well, that's the other thing that struck me when you say that you had this sense of the legacy of the Civil War. That's a lot to try to unravel in one conversation. I mean, it's not going to happen in one conversation. So I imagine that part of what we have to do is just not feel that it's all so urgent that it gets done today, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, And I just wanted to highlight in your book, there's one of the truth skills that feels really relevant. I mean, you've sort of already been talking about it, but I just wanted to name it. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about this, how one might approach, let's just say it was you and your sister, you said.
Well, I'll just say my relative right now. I don't want to
Yeah,
go
yeah.
far.
But it was, you had a difference of opinion on the election and why you felt that way and whatnot. But in the book, you talk about holding difference, and
Mhm.
as I understand it, and feel free to correct me or clarify, but it's something about the simultaneous curiosity and disagreement that's
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. So that's a skill that we might need to bring to a specific issue. I was really just trying to get to understand her whole sentiments about voting for Trump and so forth. Um, so there's not enough of a real issue there. But let's say you are um, talking to a person whose political persuasion is kind of like opposite yours. You go in first. The idea of holding differences is you go in first with, I can still stay true to my own values and beliefs. It's not going to be threatened by somebody who has a different point of view. I'm going to practice. Now, maybe it is kind of threatened, but I'm going to practice holding the tension and the discomfort of hearing somebody say, "Oh, that's not true. That's not what Fox News said," that type of thing. And I'm so maybe there's some specific value. I mean, you want to be able to have a conversation about something that's specific enough to be able to keep it focused and be clear, rather than something like should is honesty, just which group is more honest versus dishonest, something like that. That's really way too abstract, even
Although
though
that seems to be where a lot of the discussion is right now. Like there's
yeah,
kind of like
yeah, it's
it's
true.
almost like a given that what the other side is saying is just flat out a lie or flat out,
Mhm.
wrong or something. And I think what I hear often in the discourse, I mean, in the news, but in personal conversations sometimes where people are talking about it, is just like those idiots. That's what those idiots
Yeah,
think. And so this
yeah.
is a really, I mean, I'm also thinking of, I can't remember who was talking to me recently about how to, even within the parties or
Mhm.
like everyday life, not maybe not the politicians themselves, but like how hard it is even to be within the party, and you have to like be a certain, and if you would talk to someone on the other side, that you might be some kind of a traitor, like to even reach out and do that. So there's just a lot on top of this situation that makes it really, really difficult.
Yeah. So let's say the question you want to bring up with somebody is, okay, you say you voted for Trump because of his economic policies, and I voted against those economic policies. Now, let's like, what do we really, what policy you're talking about? So you have to get to that next level. And most people are not prepared with any basis for their opinion. That's my informal research, is that when I talk to most people, they're very glib about economic policies. Well, what policies? Oh, well, the economy was better when Trump was between 2016 and 2020, when Trump was president, before, and so forth. Oh, okay. When you start getting too much into data, okay, tell me why you say that. Do you have any information about that? Most people will get triggered and uncomfortable
Mm.
there. So what I would advise you to do is let the other person know that your goal here is just to learn to hold differences. Oh, you and see if see if you can just stay with, okay, I hear that you say that, and I think I was like maybe reading a different newspaper or listening to different media,
Mhm.
because that's not the data that I'm aware of. Can I tell you what my data is? So you say, okay, we seem to have a difference here.
Mhm.
I hear that you think this. I have a different perspective. Can I tell you my perspective? So that's a kind of a sentence structure that helps you speak the difference. And a lot of times you're going to also, when you're honest with your feelings, go, you know, your data is not that persuasive to me, but I love you anyway, kind of thing. Or stepping above the level of the problem, like we did with the T group, and saying, it does sound like your data source is A and mine is B. Is How do we feel about that?
Mhm.
No? And I have often gotten to the place where I go, gosh, with my brother, for example. Uh, Looks like we're watching different movies, and that is actually quite painful to me. That's a sort of a trigger for me. Uh, Probably goes way back to my relationship with my mom,
Mhm.
where I just like this was my reality and this was her reality, and it's just like very threatening when you're dependent on somebody. And you're like one of my favorite people in all the world, but we're watching different movies. That is really hard for me. And so that's kind of what I've come to some with that particular person.
Mhm.
So it's not, you're not always going to get to a comfortable place, I guess.
Right. But I can see how also just not having an agenda at all is one of the best places to be because, you know, like you're saying, to try to work out an actual agreement between myself and someone, with a totally different starting point, it's like a massive project. So, but to say something like, look how massive this project is,
Mm.
wouldn't it be nice if we could feel more connected and look at all these obstacles that we face? Now we're speaking a language that has more to do with our common experience, even though we're standing in different places.
Yeah. So there's two things that I said in one of those articles, going higher, which is look at the situation, the social situation that we're both caught in, you
Mm-hmm.
know, let's just take a moment and feel what we feel about that, this situation that divides us. And most of the time, just like back in the 60s T groups, people go, yeah, I think we actually agree on most things, don't we? And you can actually look at some of the things you agree on. Like we both want to have healthy families. We both want good clean air and water, and we want safety in our streets. And I would say there's an awful lot of things. In fact, the statistics are 80% of Americans agree about most things. But so there's the going higher, which is, yeah, isn't it kind of a shame what we're caught in? And then there's the going deeper, which is one of the benefits of this holding difference thing, where I realized with my wonderful brother, who I dearly love, that watching different movies has me kind of triggered and internally more sad than I would be with somebody else first, and also maybe more sad than another person would be about watching different movies because it's part of my childhood wound. And so this trigger work that I sometimes talk about is like you notice that you're upset about some difference, you
Mm-hmm.
just hold that upset feeling, you pause and you be with that upset feeling. Take some time out to do this by yourself. And this is like inner self-compassion work. And if I feel it, and breathe with it and realize that this is this is kind of a tender part of me, and I can support it with my breath and with my kind of loving attention. That transforms your relationship to the emotional pain that you started out with. You expand your capacity to deal with painful, uncomfortable situations because you have a way of working with yourself, your own pain. And that makes the world seem less scary, no matter what else is going on.
Hmm. Do you think that there's more space today uh, to talk about that kind of thing? I mean, I think it's easier now to say something about a childhood experience and for people to understand that's still, you know, that's still impacting my experience in today's world. But of course, those are the things that we put aside. I'm just wondering, given the passage of time and what you've seen, is that kind of, because it sounds like that's a piece that you're like, I imagine that's another place where potentially we could connect, like, oh wow, you've
Yeah.
been through all that. Or my first experience maybe of your anger is that, why are you getting angry? But then when I find out you have a hard time with a particular topic, just that association that you have might be something I could relate to, because I have certain associations that, but I don't know if you would agree that
Culture.
that's
Yeah, the culture has changed. When I first started out, I remember I used to consult with Hewlett Packard. I pitched a program called Emotions in the Workplace in the 70s. The manager says, "What emotions? We don't talk about emotions here." Now, and even 25 years ago, when I wrote the book Getting Real, there was a lot of demand for me to come in and talk about emotions in the workplace and honest feedback in the workplace. So, even from 1970 to 2000, because my book was written in, the one you showed us was 2000 and published in 2001. Big change over those 30 years. And then the last 25 years, since I've been teaching Getting Real, the culture's totally open to the whole thing, adverse childhood experiences, ACE, and all these different instruments that help. Oh, and so many people are talking about trauma nowadays and such. Now, there's still the sort of fast changers who just embrace all this new emotion-centered kind of awareness of life. And then there's I call them the slower changers that got, it's touchy-feely stuff. That's not manly, and that's a waste of time. And I do believe in certain cases the culture's gone too far, like trigger warning this and trigger warning that. I'm going, please give me a break. So
right.
I'm maybe over in the more conservative camp there, even though I'm always encouraging people to have compassion for your triggers and
Mhm.
your reactions. But that's on you. That's not on the whole world to start tiptoeing around you, because that doesn't make you emotionally stronger. The Getting Real practices are
So my
deal.
triggers are my responsibility.
My triggers are my responsibility. I can ask for help. If I can't calm myself, I could say, hey, could we have a talk? And I just unload. For some of us, co-regulation is the word. Co-regulation is asking for help with your triggers from someone else. Self-regulation is being with your own painful trigger reactions until you can calm and bring self-compassion. But that's not always possible for some of us. So you need to be able to do either self-regulation or co-regulation. And all that stuff, the word co-regulation has only been in common parlance for maybe 20 years at the most. And
Right.
this comes from childhood attachment research.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like if we have difficult problems to solve, which we certainly do in the world today, we actually don't have time necessarily to pause and talk about all our triggers all the time. So we need to be able to deal with that. Although I wonder if there is some like little between space where a person could not blame the other for, not being aware that X, Y, and Z triggers me, but just to be able to say something like, I'm not fully resourced right now. Like, I need a few minutes to get centered again, or something like that. I mean, you were talking about, at one point where there was no awareness, and then sort of we've gone too far. So I'm wondering, what is there a sweet spot, or is how do we kind of try to dance with that?
Well, the more each of us get used to the fact that triggering happens, that it's almost always connected to some kind of childhood unfinished business, some need that wasn't met. And the more we can value admitting that we're triggered, or not rejecting other people when they get triggered and not taking it personally. They'll get triggered and they'll walk out, and you'll think, well, they don't get to treat me that way. Well, just if you understand triggers, that person was not even in their right mind when they walked out. It wasn't that they don't care about you. Now you have to learn how to come back and repair. So there's a number of skills that I teach, and also that are kind of in the common conversation now, that help people be more able to go calm, or I'm not very resourced right now. Just different ways of naming that, oh, I just got, a big hit of charge here. I think I need to take a walk before I finish this conversation. And so there's a number of ways that we're learning to do that. And my most recent two books are really all about this: how to notice the early warning signs when you're triggered, how to ask for a pause, how to self-calm, and then if you said something that you wish you hadn't, go back and repair. The repair is very important. So there's like a lot of conversation about this stuff, and eventually it will get quicker and easier. Like, first you have to do this as a practice with only willing practice partners. I don't recommend that you necessarily use a lot of this kind of language that will feel like jargon to people from other subcultures. But once you integrate this into your being, you find the right language to use that works for that context.
Right. Right.
So there's a learning process going on in the culture to make everything quicker. But like you said, you can't take all the time to go pause, calm, self-soothe and so forth, right in a business meeting, let's say. But I've taught trial lawyers. I worked with trial lawyers on their triggers for many years, and they were able to, I would say, and they reported this to me, the judge would say, overruled, you don't get to speak that thing that you've prepared. I've prepared for 2 days to say this argument, and the judge won't let me say it. I'm so triggered. And it's just like when I was 7 years old, and my father always used to kind of ignore me and bat me out of the way in conversations. And they would do it in 7 seconds. They said I could do 7 seconds self-soothing and be back in the game in the courtroom right in the middle of a trial. Now, maybe that was only the top three people in the class that I taught. But anyway, some of them were able to do that. And the idea is it will get more natural and quicker with practice. But the state that most humans are in right now, we're just beginners. I always say to people in new groups, we're all beginners in this work, because it's so counter. Being honest and being this self-aware is so counter to our conditioning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most of us still have been conditioned to don't make waves, don't upset people, don't rock the boat. And that's all control-oriented communication.
Yeah.
Other kind, which I believe is necessary for a world of constant change and increasing diversity, change and conflict, two huge challenges. We need to be able to relate to each changing moment, or if we're having a trouble relate, go, oh, let me pause for just a minute so I can get back into my body before we continue this conversation. We need to be able to surf the ever-changing reality of life, rather than, okay, now everybody's going to go around the room and say one thing. Okay, that's great, but a lot of life doesn't tell you when it's your turn.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if we think about the situation today, we also have all the whole question of social media and, you know, just the way that information travels. The basic thing I feel like saying is just that it gives that sense of speeding up. But also, if I'm just interested in following the news and I'm not getting, there's just so much information, like, you know, constantly updating. So there is this like just there's just a lot there, right? And you know, and a lot of uncertainty about what are things going to look like in 5 and 10 years. So what you just said, it seems like that's not going to change. The uncertainty is definitely
Gonna get worse.
yeah, it's going to get worse. Like, thank you.
I don't pretend to know in exactly what way, but
Yeah, yeah,
change is happening faster, and we're not doing that well cooperating across differences. So, like,
yeah.
that's what at least empower yourself to do what you can do within your world. But back to your comment, I think this is a good direction.
Well, yeah, and what I wanted to get to in particular, so we talked about people of different opinions, people of different backgrounds, and now I'm thinking about people of different generations,
Hmm.
because we can talk about the future and different things, but you know, it's the young people who ultimately will be the deciders in the future, and whatever problems we have now, there has to be at a certain point a passing of the torch. And I don't know how well that's going these days, but I wonder what you would say, you know, given everything else we've talked about, you know, parents and children, or even just a sense of like people walking out on the street and seeing people from another generation and just like not understanding what are they doing and like any I'm keeping it broad, but
Sure,
just
sure.
curious
Yeah.
your thoughts on that topic.
You're reminding me of back in the 60s when people first started to grow their hair long. And
Mhm.
I had a boyfriend who was very uncomfortable with that. We both worked for a national security agency, by the way. We
Oh,
both
okay.
were
Uh-huh.
top secret, government agency. So, but he was pretty traditional. But anyway, that he used to make all kinds of comments and stereotypes, and I was very open to the new culture that was emerging.
Mhm.
Uh, but I just watched him judge the people with long hair. So nowadays, um, some of us adults will see, of course, this happens to adults too, but maybe certain generation of adults will see the younger people walking around with their face in their cell phone. Like I'm here in Honolulu right now, Waikiki, and you look around and all the kids are walking around. There's a bunch of kids. You see this in my hometown too. There are a bunch of kids that are hanging out together, but nobody's interacting with each other. They just got their phones. So I am intensely curious personally as an older person of what's it like to be young in a lot of different ways. What's it feel like to be in a world that seems a lot less predictable than the world I grew up in. Are you even kind of thinking about that? Or how are you thinking about the future? Or another one is what do you get out of being on the screen so much? So I have this intense curiosity, and as a grandparent now, I'm a little, if I just told my side of it, I'm a little worried about you guys with all the time you don't spend in nature. Or, well, one of my grandchildren, she's a surfer, and she's in nature all the time. So no worries about her. But, you know, just in general, I'm
Mhm.
worried about you young people with your faces in the screen. So how would we how would we have that conversation? Either about how you guys think about the future, or what are you doing with the phones all the time?
Mhm. Mhm.
That moves anybody to have one of those conversations. I would say again, what are my motives? And would the other person even want to be part of that conversation? I think we'd have to sell the idea. You have a daughter, right?
Yeah, I have a daughter, and I was just thinking of also um, this conversation with another parent, and that concern around screens. But something she would say to me sometimes is one of the easiest ways to connect with my kids is to watch TV together. But then it's like we're both watching the show, and now we've shared that experience. And she has a bit of, worry about screen time and everything as well. But it's like maybe you put that aside for a minute and watch the show together, and now we have this in common.
Yeah, or I mean, a lot of parents do play video games with their kid,
Mhm.
but let's say you sticking with the theme of this conversation, dealing with differences and trying to speak across the differences. Maybe you won't even know if there's a difference right away, but I would assume for a lot of parents, they would rather have their kids less time on the screen. So if you're one of those parents, you might invite your child into, uh, no, I saw this interview or I read this book that talked that it's kind of a good thing to be able to have a conversation with somebody who has a different opinion than you do or a different way of doing things,
Mhm.
just to learn how to have a different feeling and not be so afraid of that. And I'm still growing because my parents were growing their whole life. You know, they read self-help books when
Mhm.
there was only like five on the market. But
Mhm.
anyway, I'm the kind of parent who likes to keep growing and learning. And I'm sure there's something I can learn from you. Are you willing to have this conversation? So you might have to sell the idea that you're really open and you're not going to try to change their behavior. So yeah, there's some things where you really do want to change your child's behavior or your friend or anybody or their thoughts. I'm just recommending you don't start out that way. No,
Mhm.
you may go now. Can I tell you what I really wish if I had, my wish about you? But you don't start there. You start with your curiosity, you start with really noticing how it feels to hear what they say, and you go, oh my God, they think that. Uh, they put so much emphasis on, how they appear, on how many likes they get, all this stuff. So give yourself some practice being with your feelings, hearing a difference from your own child. That could really help you as a parent because differences between you guys are not going to go away. And maybe you can develop in your child a little more interest in that kind of personal growth.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, so there's that moment where my child says something where there's no difficulty noticing the internal dissonance I feel. And
Mhm,
yet, if I don't jump to say it and I can just hold that feeling, um, but continue to create this feeling of I'm listening, then
mhm,
then there's more there. And yeah, I've had the experience a couple of times of starting in one place and just sort of like biting my tongue. And then we get to something that's really, feels like I can really feel the connection that and then I'll look back and I'll say, if I would have said what I was thinking earlier, we wouldn't have ever arrived, at that other place.
Now, that's a good practice to kind of hold your water for a while, but it's also a good practice.
Mhm.
Uh, Listening to you just reminded me of this to say, and gee, we've been talking for 15 minutes now. Let's step back from this conversation and I'd like to share some of the things that have been going on in the background for me. I was trying so hard to be a good listener, but I want to tell you about how I was feeling, and I'd like to hear what was going on for you. And that's a very good communication skill on any topic at all. I mean, I write in one of the books about this couple who's just started dating a few months and they're having sex for the first time. And it turns out when they stop and go, could we just talk about how we're feeling right now? Turned out neither one of them really wanted to be having sex. They thought the other person wanted it. So that's just another use for this. Hey,
Right.
could we pause and see how we've been feeling about this conversation? And again, you're modeling and teaching your child some really good practices that they're going to need for the coming world of constant change and learning how to trust yourself again. Trust that I don't have to always hold my tongue, or I can hold it for a little while, but then I can create a way to share it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like we don't have a black and white world. And if we want to create a world that can hold more of our truth, even if they're different truths, uh, like without having to shut ourselves down all the time, but also to be a little more mindful of the context. And I'm the dad and she's the daughter, and I don't want to shut her down, that type of thing. So you have to be sometimes strategic for the good of the real context.
Mm-hmm.
So total honesty gives you, I mean, the total honesty in every moment you're thinking it is not the idea so much as once you're aware of the complexity of a situation, and these practices help you become more aware of more factors all at once. Like I'm aware that what I'm saying, but I'm also aware that if I do this, she's going to have that reaction.
Mm.
That actually is even more honest because you're perceiving more of the total reality as time goes by, as you develop these skills. So
Yeah.
it's like, it's not like I'm honest or I'm not honest. It's I'm more aware of a total context, which changes how I do honesty.
Mm-hmm. It's like we're having this conversation about this topic, but then we're having an experience of this conversation. And what I'm hearing is we can talk about the experience we're having together as we talk as a as another level of what's happening.
Yeah, and that's very satisfying. What you just said, it's very satisfying when people are able to do that. And it's a high level communication skill.
Hmm. Well, you've definitely made clear how complex it can be, but I know that you regularly help people to gain more skill in this, and it's been a pleasure talking with you. And maybe some people listening would like to find out how they can actually get more into the practice. So I'd love it if you would share some information about what you're offering, and of course we can put information along with this video as well.
I still do workshops. So I've got a 10 True Skills workshop starting January 16th. So, no, a couple months or less from now. It goes for 6 weeks, and I teach the true skills, and we practice in dyads and group and small groups. And I've got another one, that same content in May at my house. That'll be for a limited number of people. I can only take 18 in my group room or on my deck, depending on the weather. But come visit me in Sebastopol, California, May 10th and 11th. So Truth Skills, both of those, and trigger work. And I do a monthly free group coaching call. They have different topics. Um, Sometimes it's just Q&A, but most of the time there's an actual topic. And those are the first Tuesday of every month, except for uh, today. I canceled it so I could do this.
Because you're in Hawaii. Okay.
Almost every first Tuesday of the month. Of course, this won't come out on a Tuesday, but and it's free. And I send the Zoom link and the topic out in my at the end of my Substack posts. I always have upcoming events, including the free one.
Great.
And then there's my books. So go to susancampbell.com or any bookseller and just put my name in, and I'll show you all the books. And
And
they're all
one other
they're
thing,
all great. They're all useful.
and there's a card game, right?
Oh yeah, and I've created 3 card games. One's for like a family or general public or whoever you want to get to know better, called the Getting Real card game. And then there's a Truth in Dating card game, which is both for couples and people who are just getting to know each other, or groups of singles. And then there's a Truth at Work game where it's mostly for work teams. It's like a team building game. So yeah, those are only available at susancampbell.com. The games, the books are widely available.
Holiday gifts for people you want to get real with.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. It's just a real pleasure, and I hope more people will get interested in getting real as a result of this.
Yeah, learning. It's all about making your life about learning, and almost there's always something to learn. So, you can't fail.
Mm.
Great talking to you, Seth.
Thanks, Susan.